There's really no mystery to understanding a material safety data sheet. It's like putting the pieces of a puzzle together. By knowing and being familiar with every part of the MSDS, you can clearly appreciate the whole picture of maintaining a safe workplace. Almost everything you could possibly want to know about the safe handling of a material in your workplace is found in an MSDS. But learning to use an MSDS on a regular basis is often frustrating.
With all this information to look through, how can I find what I need in a hurry?
Can't this information be organized in a more logical, concise way?
In response to these complaints and others, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, has approved a standardized format for material safety data sheets that was developed by the Chemical Manufacturers Association. This format has 16 sections arranged in a concise and logical order. For example, information on the product itself and emergency situations is at the beginning, and specific technical information about the material is toward the end. And in the case of an emergency, its simple design allows you to find information quickly, rather than spending critical time searching for it. In this program, you will learn how to use material safety data sheets by knowing the standard format of MSDSs, as well as understanding the content of each section. Perhaps more importantly, this program will encourage you to pick up an MSDS and read it before you need it. You probably already know that the Hazard Communication Standard, the Right to Know law, requires that your employer inform you of potential hazards associated with materials you work with. Through HazCom training and reading labels, you can learn about these hazards, but you can also learn about the materials you work with by reading material safety data sheets. Your employer is required to have these MSDSs readily available during every work shift. You should read the MSDS for each material before you begin working with that material. Let's go over each section so you can learn how to use an MSDS. You'll also learn that these 16 sections can easily be remembered if they're grouped into main categories: product information, exposure situations, hazard prevention and protection, and other specific information. Section 1 identifies the material by its name. Spelling variations, synonyms, different grades or types may be used. However, the name listed beside product name will be the same as the one on the label. For example, hydrochloric acid has synonyms like muriatic acid, swimming pool acid, and concrete acid. But the product name at the top of the MSDS is hydrochloric acid and matches the name on the container label. The preparation date will be at the top of the MSDS or in Section 1. So if you find two MSDSs for one chemical, be sure to check the dates and use the most recent one. The manufacturer's name, address, and phone number are in Section 1, and more often than not, emergency phone numbers will also be listed for immediate assistance. You'll often find the number for Chemtrec, an emergency response service of the Chemical Manufacturers Association. Section 2 lists the components of the material listed in Section 1. These components may or may not be hazardous themselves, though. For example, water makes up more than 30% of this industrial cleaner. Of course, water alone is not hazardous. However, if you work with this chemical, you might want to know that up to 10% of its makeup is ethyl alcohol, which will irritate your skin and, if swallowed, can possibly cause birth defects. Ingredients which are trade secrets can be withheld from the MSDS. However, their hazards and how to safely control them will be provided for your protection. Because you work with so many chemicals which may be hazardous to your health, specific exposure limits have been established for your safety. You'll either find these limits here in Section 2 or in Section 8. Two common limits are time-weighted averages, or TWAs, known as the TLV, threshold limit value, and PEL, permissible exposure limit. These are acceptable concentrations of a material averaged over an 8-hour workday that you can be exposed to without expected adverse effects. However, the TLV and PEL don't consider extreme levels that should only be tolerated for short periods of time. The short-term exposure limit, or STEL, does. The short-term exposure limit is an acceptable concentration for most people that you can safely be exposed to measured over a 15-minute period. Often you will find a ceiling value, which is a concentration of a material that should never be exceeded during any part of your working exposure. Is it flammable, corrosive, or toxic? Designed for emergency responders, the first part of Section 3 will often be an emergency overview. It describes the material's appearance and immediate potential hazards, but it's not intended to tell you about every possible hazard you may encounter. Section 3 also lists potential health effects by providing information on routes of entry and symptoms of overexposure. For example, this worker doesn't know why his hand feels itchy and irritated. But earlier in the day, he worked with a chemical and forgot to wear his gloves. So he checks the Msds and finds that skin contact with this chemical can cause irritation, which may not occur immediately. Always check the potential health effects in Section 3 when you need to know symptoms to watch for following contact with a particular material. Chronic or delayed effects will be found at the very end of Section 3. For example, some commonly used chemicals in healthcare facilities, such as ethylene oxide and nitrous oxide, can possibly cause reproductive damage. Also, formaldehyde, a chemical that preserves specimens, is a suspected carcinogen. Remember, Sections 1, 2, and 3 cover product information and provide basic information about a material and identifies its immediate hazards. The first aid section explains in clear, non-technical language what to do in exposure situations. Some common phrases might be, flush eye with water for 15 minutes. Under inhalation, remove to fresh air. If not breathing, give artificial respiration. And for skin contact, you will often be advised to immediately flush skin with plenty of water for at least 15 minutes. Always check Section 4 for first aid measures, whether it seems like a big emergency or not. The fifth section includes properties that cause a particular material to be a potential fire hazard. You'll need to understand terms such as flammable limits, flash point, and auto-ignition temperature. The flammable limits provide a range of vapor concentrations in air that will produce fire when an ignition source is present. Usually there will be a lower explosive limit, or LEL, and an upper explosive limit, or UEL. Any concentration of a substance in air between these figures can produce an explosion when an ignition source is present. Any substance with a concentration above the UEL or below the LEL is less likely to ignite. The flash point is the lowest temperature at which a liquid gives off enough vapor to form an ignitable mixture with air and produce a flame when a source of ignition is present. Be sure to look for the term auto-ignition. Auto-ignition is the temperature at which a material will spontaneously ignite or burn without an ignition source. When a material burns, certain products will be emitted that may be hazardous. These hazardous combustion products will be listed here as well. Section 5 will also include some basic firefighting guidance and tell you which extinguishing agent to use. Section 6 describes what to do in case of an accidental spill and is designed mainly for those trained in responding to emergencies. Instructions on containing the spill, whether it is large, small, on land, or in water, are included. For example, In a healthcare facility, if an ethylene oxide leak occurs, eliminate all sources of ignition, find the leak, and then shut off the lead valve. Most information you will need to know about a material during an emergency will be found in sections 4, 5, and 6. Section 7 provides general and specific practices for safe handling and storage. These practices will minimize your direct contact with the material, reduce fire hazards or other reactions, and prevent release of the material. This section also tells you which conditions to avoid when storing the material, like excessive heat, direct sunlight, or vibration. You'll find general statements about handling and storage, such as use only in a well-ventilated area and store away from heat. But be alert to more specific statements to protect yourself. For example, formaldehyde must be stored in the flammable liquids cabinet or storage room and separate from incompatible materials. The first part of Section 8 describes engineering controls, such as ventilation. Part of controlling potential risks involves keeping exposures at a safe level. For this reason, the exposure levels described earlier in Section 2 will often be listed here as well. For you, the most important part of Section 8 is personal protective equipment, or PPE. Proper PPE for everyday working situations as well as for emergencies will be listed. You might be warned to wear goggles, rubber gloves, or even full protective clothing. But pay special attention to the type of respirator the Msds suggests. Always know the proper PPE to wear for the chemicals you work with. Section 9 gives you a detailed list of physical and chemical properties. For example, the Msds for sulfuric acid calls it a clear to slightly cloudy, oily liquid with an odorless to slightly pungent odor. Section 9 will also list evaporation rate, melting, and boiling points, to name a few. Knowing these characteristics will help you work with hazardous materials safely. Section 10 names the chemicals and other materials that are incompatible with the product. For example, you'll want to avoid strong oxidizing agents when you work with toluene. And note that mixtures with tetranitroethane can become explosive. Section 10 also tells you whether the material is stable or unstable. Unstable material could become self-reactive, polymerize, decompose, or condense under reasonable conditions of handling and storage. Hazardous products that occur from decomposition of a material will be found in Section 10. For example, during decomposition of the anti-cancer drug adriamycin, toxic fumes of hydrochloric acid and oxides of nitrogen are emitted. Remember, for information on preventing emergency situations and protecting yourself, look in sections 7 through 10. Will this material damage genetic properties or have reproductive effects? To what extent does this material irritate the skin and eyes? The answers to these types of questions are in Section 11 in the form of detailed laboratory test results and analyses. These test results help determine the effects a material might have on humans. Typically, this information is needed by physicians and toxicologists. Section 12 describes the effects a material has on the land, water, and air if it is accidentally released. Specifically, it provides information for environmental professionals on how to evaluate accidental spills or leaks. Information on disposal, including classification and identification, is found in Section 13. It includes limitations and restrictions, as well as recommended or acceptable disposal practices. For example, formaldehyde must be disposed as hazardous waste in a RCRA-approved facility, or dissolved in an appropriate combustible solvent and atomized in a RCRA-approved chemical incinerator equipped with an afterburner. Section 14 contains information helpful in properly shipping the material. This section will tell you the material's proper shipping name, ID number, U.S. regulations, and, if appropriate, international shipping information. Section 15 includes state, federal, and international regulatory information. This information will help employers comply with health, safety, and environmental regulations. Additional information which may not be covered under the standardized headings will be in Section 16. Be sure to check this section for explanations on abbreviations, revision information, references, label texts, and hazard ratings. Now, what does all of this information mean to you?
It means a lot to remember. There's 16 parts to the MSDS.
Yes, but it's well organized and fairly simple to remember. Remember the guide. Product information, sections 1, 2, and 3. Exposure situations, sections 4, 5, and 6. And for hazard prevention and protection, sections 7 through 10. And check 11 through 16 for other specific information.
Will I really need to know all the information listed in the MSDS?
Maybe not everything, but you should be aware of how to use an MSDS and where you can quickly find important information. Remember, the MSDS does not take the place of common sense or caution. If you have doubts about a material you work with, be sure to ask your supervisor. Material safety data sheets are for your safety. They may very well be the best reading found on the job. When you're unsure about a material you work with, or you just need more information about it, pick up an MSDS and read it before you need it.